is up? I'm Sergeant Ballistic, but you guys can call me Brian. Thank you for checking out this video. I present to you Draconem Tigris, the $1,100 micro ATX portable LAN scrap build, quote unquote. This is a pretty interesting build for quite a few reasons. My buddy Eric actually used the 3 main components in this build in his previous build, but as PC enthusiasts are apt to do, he wanted to see some performance increases, so he spec'd out and picked up a brand new Z170 i5-6600K and GTX 980 Ti. That build is going to be a beast, so stay tuned for a couple videos on it. But what to do with the motherboard and GTX 970 from MSI, along with the non-K-SKU CPU from his old build. Why not build a whole new computer? This one being still a very solid build capable of 1080p 60 FPS gaming, but in a more portable form factor. As for the name Draconem Tigris, it means dragon tiger. The dragon part is pretty obvious, as this definitely fits the bill for an MSI Dragon Army build. As for the tiger part, you'll have to hold on for a little bit for that. So looking at the build, we're using a Z87M Mobo from MSI, the 4770, that's right, the non-overclockable i7 Haswell CPU, which is probably going to raise a couple flags for some people. But I think a lot of people overestimate the number of gamers that buy a K-SKU and actually end up overclocking it. I know a lot of the people I've helped out with their builds get the K, and a lot don't even go into their BIOS to make sure that it's turboing properly. You do miss out on some performance with the non-K-SKU on top of not being able to overclock, but with most AAA titles not being very CPU bound, it could make sense to skip the K-SKU and use the extra $50 to $100 somewhere else in your build, like on the GPU. As for the Z87 Mobo, it also misses out on some of the new technology available in equivalent boards using the Z97 and Z170 chipsets. Recently, motherboard manufacturers seem to have noticed that even non-hardcore enthusiast gamers like to have more visually appealing builds and are now offering gaming variants of their lower end chipset boards to cater to these customers. If you're building a new system, check out something like MSI's H170 to pair with your non-K-SKU CPU in order to save maybe 40 to 50 bucks versus something like a Z170A board. Now taking a look at some of the other parts, we're reusing the storage and OS from the previous build, including this 240GB Corsair Force SSD for the OS and some of the applications, along with a WD 1TB green drive. Corsair SSD is still performing well, but as for the 1TB hard disk, definitely look to get a blue or black 1TB from WD or an equivalent from another company. This was picked up a few years ago when 1TB drives were still well over $100, whereas now they can easily be found for as low as $50. The RAM user for this build is my standard go-to of Corsair Vengeance, which I had laying around after being pulled from another build. The only thing I would change here is possibly the color to something like the red version, but in keeping with the scrap build mentality, you just got to use what you have on hand sometimes. The PSU is one of the only new components in this build, and this is the Bitfenix Fury 650 watt, probably a bit excessive for our needs. We could have utilized a 550 watt, seeing as it's unlikely we'll be adding a GPU or any other components to this build whatsoever. The main point of the build is to be fairly light and portable. This was my first time using the Fury PSU, and I was pleasantly surprised to see it came with fully sleeved cables out of the box. Quality is pretty nice on them. They definitely add to the overall clean look of the build, but beware, the length of them is set up to allow them to be used in larger mid-tower builds, so for a small form factor build you'll have to deal with a lot of excess cabling, which wasn't too much of a problem in this case. And yes, now we get to the case. This is the Cuboid Micro ATX / Mini ITX case from DIYPC. I was pretty skeptical when my buddy picked it out. He really liked the look of it and the price. I'd seen it on sale for as low as $50 on Newegg, and I didn't think it had all that much to offer, honestly. But when I finally got around to building in it, I was pretty pleasantly surprised. It's got a nice black soft touch plastic matte finish, accented by a couple of red highlights. It comes with a large 200mm fan in the front and a 120mm fan in the rear, which I ended up removing and putting up top in order to make room for the Corsair H60 cooler, which was also being repurposed from an old build. Both the fans are red LED lit. The fans are probably the first place you're going to notice a bit of cost cutting for that $60 price tag. They're not terribly loud, but they're a pretty inexpensive feeling plastic with unknown bearing types. They don't really inspire any thoughts of longevity, but they'll get the job done initially. Another thing I didn't really like about the build were the driveways, which had these pretty cool slide out toolless drive bays, but again, the plastic felt pretty cheap and did tear up a little bit as I was swapping drives in and out. The SSD trays are in this cool little swing out bay, but instead of using thumb screws, they chose to use a regular screwdriver driven screw, which kind of makes it annoying to be able to hot swap drives in and out. The last noteworthy thing was that I did have to remove the ODD bay in order to fit the full length GPU in. But overall, it's a pretty nice little case for the price. I'd say if you absolutely need to cut $30 off your budget, don't be afraid to look at a case like this. I absolutely love the horizontal layout for the micro ATX board, and the windowed side panels on both sides makes it so you can see your build and the actual cooler and heat shroud of the GPU, which is pretty unusual for a micro ATX build. But all that said, let's take a look at the performance, and really this is a prime example of the fact that for gaming, most of your performance comes from your graphics card. While our CPU and motherboard are older and not optimal for the absolute best enthusiast build, but the GTX 970 from MSI is bolstering the load, averaging well over 100 FPS in most of the titles tested. I did a mixture of synthetic benchmarks along with some canned and in-game benchmarks where available, and hopefully you can use these to judge performance against your own builds or perhaps other benchmarks you've seen. Starting off with Firestrike, you see it got a 9812, which is higher than 75% of the entries. When compared to my 4790K and GTX 980 score, you see it's definitely behind in the graphics test, but only around 19 or 20%. The Cinebench and Unigine Heaven scores are right about where you'd expect. Now, taking a look at some of the gaming benchmarks, most of these were averaging well over 100 FPS, with the worst mins being in the 30 to 40 FPS range, typically coming from actual in-game play in titles like Metro Last Light and BioShock Infinite. Looking at a game type like a MOBA or a source game like Counter-Strike, it's averaging well over 250 FPS with a min of 122, so great for pushing pixels to 144Hz 1080p monitor. And other shooters like Battlefield and Rainbow Six Siege are also going to be averaging over 120 frames per second with high or very high settings, which is ideal for fast-paced Twitch shooters. So I gotta say, I'm very happy with this build. It's a great example how you can repurpose some parts instead of having to try to sell them and not really making your money back. You can create a second build in a less expensive case that you don't mind toting around. So that is it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. As I mentioned, there'll probably be at least one other video on this build, possibly with some cool mods, so stay tuned for that. Also stay tuned for a dope high-end build with a time-lapse and overview video and videos on any type of modding that we might do for that as well. Go Firestrike Ice Storm on that like button. If you want to see more build videos on the channel, subscribe if you already haven't, and make sure to follow me on your favorite social media sites. Thanks again for watching. I'll catch you in the next video. Peace out.